He was a researcher at Apple and Xerox PARC. Currently, he's a professor of informatics in the School of Information and Computer Sciences at University of California, Irvine, and he also has a courtesy appointment in their School of Anthropology. He's been a pioneer in many of the fields that we're working on now. He did early research into awareness in computer systems, social navigation, way before Amazon was recommending and other people bought. Paul was writing about these things. And most recently, embodiment and ubiquitous computing. In 2001, he wrote a book, it was published, he wrote it before that, a book called Where the Action Is. And I just want to read you two quick quotes of reviews from this book. This is the first book to provide a broad view of how our interaction with computers is intertwined with our physical world. Paul Dourish's book will only increase in importance as the social nature of computing becomes evident to a new generation of technologists. Think of the number of times we've heard the word social today. He was writing about these things 9 years ago. He's currently working on books about social informatics and the cultural aspects of ubiquitous computing. Please help me welcome Paul Dourish.
Good morning. It's, I should say, the one very important thing that was not in that otherwise extensive and very kind introduction is I'm the person standing between you and lunch. So I just wanted to point out that I am actually conscious of that. So what I want to talk about this morning is some ideas that very much pick up on some of the themes that we've heard in the last two presentations. I'm going to try and take them in some slightly different directions as I talk about and think about not simply what we can learn from ethnographic work, but how we might want to, in a technological context, imagine the relationship between ethnographic work and design practice. And we have seen over the last 10 or more years an increasing interest in the technological design community with what it is we can get from social science, how we can incorporate ethnography to the extent where we do have ethnographers working at places like Nokia and Intel. But the question exactly about how we put those things together, how we understand what ethnography can teach us, those questions remain somewhat fraught. Now, perhaps one of the reasons that I was sort of invited here in the first place is because of a presentation that I gave at the CHI conference in Montreal in 2006, a paper entitled Implications for Design. And the reason I called it Implications for Design is what I had in my focus was that section that we frequently find at the end of ethnographic research reports, or which we are continually expected to provide at the end of research papers, where having presented some ethnographic material, we are then asked to provide, preferably within a couple of sentences marked by little bullet points on the last page of the paper, what the implications for design are. And I was suggesting in that paper, and continue to suggest, and it continues to get me in trouble, that the presence or absence of implications for design, particularly those sort of bullet point statements, is not necessarily the best measure of ethnographic work, that there might be other ways that we can try to extract material that is going to be generative of design practice. Because what I think gets missed when we think about ethnography purely as a way to understand what kind of things we can build and get people to buy, and I think in both of the presentations that have preceded me this morning, we've seen much richer ways of thinking about what ethnography might be able to do. If we do just think about it in that narrow way, as trying to, as a sort of form of market research with slightly more academic validity, then we miss a lot of important things about ethnographic practice. We miss its grounding as an analytic practice, not purely an empirical practice, not simply a way of gathering data and finding out about people who are not us, but also as a way of thinking about what things matter to them and building a series of sort of theoretical statements about forms of life, forms of experience. We miss also, and this seems to me tremendously important as we're sort of at this interdisciplinary moment, bringing all sorts of different people together as we have at this conference and as we do increasingly in the academy as well. We miss a series of important kinds of disciplinary power relationships. I find it interesting that the ethnographers might frequently be asked what their implications for design are, whereas it's not actually possible for me to stand up and ask a computer scientist what his implications are for social science theory. That one still kind of gets me in trouble. So that's sort of the background context. I don't want to go through all of these, but that was sort of the context, a paper, as I said, that I gave in 2006. And I've been hearing a lot about it since. And frequently, the context in which I hear about it is perhaps a misreading or a misunderstanding of what's going on. And so in some ways, my attempt on the stage today is to fix some of the ways in which this work has been read. And in particular, what I found immediately was that people thought that what I was saying was that ethnographic results aren't actually significant for design, and therefore ethnographers should not be asked to provide these kinds of implications. And that really isn't what I was saying. Now you might wonder, I mean, it's frequently the case that when you give a presentation or you talk to people one-on-one that you are misunderstood, and you think, well, what do I have to do in order to get my point across? Do I have to stand underneath a large image that tries to explain to people what it is I am and I'm not saying? And of course, that actually is exactly what I did at CHI, as somebody conveniently documented on Flickr. Despite the fact that I had slides saying what I'm saying and what I'm not saying, nonetheless, this reading that what I was trying to say was suggest that ethnography was not relevant for design. And this was nonsense. Of course, that wasn't what I was saying. In fact, again, the previous presentations have made clear that that would be a foolish thing to say. So what I want to do today, as a way of amplifying that, is to try to show some of the ways that I think we can pick up on the implications that classical ethnographies, classical anthropological ethnographies might have for some topics that are, I think, of relevance to the things we're talking about at this conference. And in particular, I want to focus on questions of mobility. And again, sort of amplifying some of the things that came out of the last couple of talks, focusing on sort of some of the symbolic considerations when we try to think about mobility, presence, absence, just being in places. So if we approach the topic of mobility from the perspective of technological design, if we approach the topic of mobility as people concerned with the delivery of new kinds of mobile experiences on a variety of technological platforms, then the kinds of concepts that come to mind are these kinds of concepts, I think. We start to think about longitude and latitude, GPS, the variety of kinds of detailed specifications of presence that we might be able to get from different kind of location technologies. We think about how we want to localize, adapt to varying contexts, and so forth. But I want to try to approach the problem of mobility from a very different perspective, the kind of perspective we might get from anthropology or from ethnographic engagements, in which case I think a very different set of concepts come into play. These sorts of notions of thinking not so much of mobility, but different kinds of mobility, such as pilgrimages, migrations, diasporas, movements between countries for a variety of reasons, daily commutes, movements of significance, trips home, the return to the ancestral home, and so forth, suggest a different series of resonances that mobility and mobilities might suggest. They suggest a way in which our presence or absence in particular kinds of places, our movements through different kinds of spaces, might carry, again pulling up on some ideas from the previous couple of talks, might carry important symbolism for who we are and for how we think about who we are, how we enact who we are, and how we relate who we are amongst each other. And that's sort of what I want to do. And I want to do this, again, and this is in the sense of what can we learn, what can we take from ethnography with or without implications for design. I want to talk very quickly, very quickly, about a couple of anthropological pieces that we might want to draw upon there. And now these pieces were both done as classical anthropological pieces of work. They were not done by people working for Intel or Nokia or Xerox or IBM or any technological company. They were not done in order to present a series of technical implications for design for this kind of audience. They were written for anthropologists, right? That's largely who anthropologists write for. They were done without any regard to technological interventions. But, and I want to try and show this, I think they have some really important consequences for how we want to think about mobility. The first is some work by an Australian anthropologist, Nancy Munn, and her studies of Australian Aboriginal navigation. And in particular, her focus is on sort of the presence or absence of people from the landscape, the places from which they are excluded or from which they exclude themselves. what is in focus here is that patterns of navigation, that is how you want to get from point A to point B, are in the Australian context, or the Aboriginal context, cannot be divorced from a variety of other concerns about, for instance, who you are. Because your navigation through a landscape will have to be done with respect to various kinds of sacred sites, centers of significance, and different kinds of potency. The landscape for Aboriginal Australians is one that carries the imprint of a whole variety of actions, both historical and mythic. And your relationship to those actions, or to whether a historical relationship in terms of your presence or absence, a kinship relationship, that is whether the things that happened there are ones that happened to people who are closely related to you or distantly related to you, part of your tribe or another, part of your clan or another. These are the ways in which the different spaces through which you move take on certain kinds of significance. And as you move around then, you sort of mark those spaces, mark those significances by your presence or absence in different sorts of spots. So, for example, a series of ritual exclusions prevent people who are classificatory who have a sort of classificatory relationship of mothers-in-law and sons-in-law to meet. They're not meant to come into contact with each other. You know, you try to avoid the parts of town where you might encounter others who are of the subsection, such that they might become your mother-in-law. I'm still frequently intrigued by the relationship between that and various Western notions about relationship between sons-in-law and mothers-in-law, whether they're connected or not. But nonetheless, you see this in the way in which people move around, so that the presence of certain particular others creates an exclusion, creates a ritual exclusion that will prevent you from being there. And it may be that the only way you can actually tell that a place has a certain kind of significance is by the way in which others avoid it. So the space through which we move takes on a certain kind of structuring, takes on a certain kind of meaning, which is enacted through these sorts of forms of ritual exclusion. Now, these are very different ways of understanding space from the sort of Western cartographic notions. It's not as if there's a region that's demarked by a series of boundaries, lines on a map that indicate where the bad places are or the good places are. These are rather sort of spreading zones that are sort of centered in a particular place, and where sort of the potency of that place spreads out. And how relevant it is to you might depend upon your closeness to a particular series of events. So it might be, for instance, that the place where your father died is particularly bad, the place where your grandfather died not quite so bad, your great-great-grandfather not quite so bad as, again, and so forth. So this is a very different kind of notion of space than the kind of cartographic notion that we have, which in part accounts for the difficulty in the encounter between Western colonial settlers in Australia and the indigenous peoples. So a very different kind of account of space, but one that's deeply grounded in questions of identity, kinship, and so forth. The second piece I want to talk about before I pull it back to some technological questions is another anthropological piece, this one done by Lisa Mulkey from Stanford she was doing a study of Hutu refugees from Burundi in Tanzania, working with a variety of groups of people, some who were in refugee camps, some who had settled in cities, looking at how it was they thought about their identity as refugees. And the interesting thing here, I'll read you a little piece from it, but you might think of refugee status as in some ways what Goffman called spoiled identity, right? You are somehow out of the norm. You are displaced from where you ought to be. You are in some kind of curious liminal state that's not quite correct, and there's a certain kind of stigma associated with it. What's intriguing in Mulkey's work is that she finds exactly the opposite. What she says, I'm sorry, I don't have this committed to memory, far from being a spoiled identity, refugee status was valued and protected as a sign of the ultimate temporariness of exile and of the refusal to become naturalized, to put down roots in a place to which one did not belong. So by pointing to their refugee status, what her informants are doing is claiming a certain kind of ethnic identity which displaces otherwise an identity that would be defined by nation states. So it allows them to say in a radically different, or say I am Hutu rather than I am Burundi, and to do something radically different in that because it's a claim of ethnic status, not a claim of national status. And they can only do that because of the ways they have been displaced from Burundi. It's the movement and their presence in a different space that allows them to do that. Yeah? In fact, she sees radical differences between the people in the refugee camps and the people who have settled in the cities with respect to how they claim forms of identity around where they are and where they expect to be in the future. So there's a moral order in some ways to these kinds of claims, a morality to the ways in which you note your presence in different kinds of spaces. Okay. Let's try and talk about some technology that we might, or some ways in which this might inform technological design, even though neither Malky nor Munn were attempting to outline a series of implications for design. What they've given us is a way of looking at space that I think is has all sorts of radical implications for how we think about technologically mediated spaces. And in particular, recently I've been doing a study, along with a couple of colleagues at UCI, of paroled sex offenders in California who were tagged with GPS bracelets as part of their parole conditions. I always have to point out when I put up this slide that neither of the people on this slide, to the best of my knowledge, is a paroled sex offender. In fact, one of them, the person on the left, is a member of the Washington State Legislature who wore a GPS bracelet as part of his tough on crime thing, although I prefer to reinterpret it as a proposal that we tag our legislators in order to figure out where it is they're going and to keep them excluded from various places where we might not want them to be. What's going on for these sex offenders is that they are, by their parole conditions, exclude them from certain kinds of places. They have to stay outside of 2,000 feet of a public park, a playground, a school, a library, and so forth, the sorts of places where you might find children. They also are not necessarily allowed to go beyond a certain kind of zone from more than 25 miles from where they live, and so forth. Now, we think about these kinds of, so I'm talking about these people not necessarily because I want to figure them as prototypical users and understand better technology for paroled sex offenders, but because I find in this a whole series of resonances with the sorts of ways in which Malky would talk about the morality of presence and the kinds of claims of identity that are made around presence. And I find a lot of resonances in it with the way in which Munn would talk about the significance of spatial exclusions and the ways in which certain kinds of social relationships are enacted through those kinds of spatial exclusions. I find a series of resonances in it that show us something about the way in which, again, the space and your presence and absence in it, the kinds of accountabilities that you have to others for being places or not being places, is a way in which social relationships are enacted. It is, again, picking up on some of the things Genevieve said, a very different way of thinking about privacy. The sex offenders have, in a variety of ways, abrogated their social rights to privacy, their civic rights to privacy, and yet they still are enmeshed in a series of graduated accountabilities to different kinds of others, whether that be the police, their parole officers, or whatever, for their presence or absence in certain kind of places. We can pick that up. This is a piece of design work that one of my students, Eric Kabish, is doing, where he's building a system that allows you to move through space, driving around, looking at the environment in a way that simultaneously gives you a view of the space that you're moving through, out the windows of the vehicle, but also by looking through this periscope, you're looking at it as a 3D generated topology that gives you that's based on georeference data such as marketing data, micro-marketing data, census data, disease incidents, and so forth, that again is trying to pick up on these ideas of trying to understand space in the way in which, and representations of space as ways in which certain kinds of social relationships are being maintained. The important thing here, of course, is that you're seeing space not only as you understand it, but also as it's represented by those who have some kind of control over it, those who surveil it, and those who manage it. So, the reason I'm trying to talk about these things is to propose an alternative way of understanding and linking ethnographic practice to design practice, one that doesn't look towards ethnography as a way of generating directly a series of implications for design or marketing data that tells me about the people I might be able to sell stuff to, but rather that focuses on the analytic contributions that ethnographic work makes, the frames, the concepts, the ways in which things are put together, the ways in which we focus on forms of life rather than on prototypical consumers. Thanks.